MakeReal specialises in creating immersive learning solutions across a range of technologies. To download their latest academic paper on how to turn learners into activists, visit makereal.co.uk/activists. Stanford gave it a fail. Harvard's verdict: self-satisfied, self-perpetuating, poorly policed. And Donald Clark says it's a cult. So who is going to stand up for leadership learning? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
What's happening to leadership? Traditionally, it was the most prestigious and well-funded branch of organisational learning. But while the money is still there, gazillions in fact, and while it may have become increasingly democratised and woke in recent times, some of the lustre seems to be wearing off. The king is in the altogether, say its critics in academe. The emperor has no clothes. Leadership learning is a rip-off, a distraction, a racket. So we thought we'd talk to the head of one of the most prestigious purveyors of executive development, based here in the UK but with global reach, and see what he had to say for himself. Kate Fitzgerald, head of FACT. Who was this brave individual?
Hack Facts.
Gustav Nordbeck is CEO of Headspring, a joint venture between the Financial Times and IE Business School. He has a background in psychology and a successful track record in finance and education. Headspring specialises in executive development. Under Gustav's direction, it has become recognised as a top provider of leadership solutions for clients around the world.
So, Jay Curtis, head of themes. How badly did I make him bleed?
Actually, John, you were far more deferential than you're trying to make out. You had a very polite discussion about how leadership varies between different sectors and geographies, and from learner to learner.
It's my boiling frog technique, Jay.
Don't try to blind me with technical terms. And you ended up by talking about AI and how terrible everything's going to be in the future, the way you always do.
I'm beginning to wonder whether I need to do some leadership learning. Well, if I'm being honest, Gustav gave a pretty good account of himself and Headspring as a class act. But as to whether today's style of leadership learning can maintain relevance in a world where more and more of the key decisions are taken by machines, well, you decide. But first, if you want us to go on fearlessly asking the tough questions in learning, if you want exclusive benefits and bonus content, why not become a patron of The Learning Hack? Go to patreon.com/learninghack and help to keep the vibe alive. Gustav Nordbeck, it's really great to have you on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thanks, John. I'm delighted to be on the show today.
You are CEO of Headspring, which has a proud lineage as a joint venture between the Financial Times and IE Business School. How did you come to helm a leadership learning company? What in your career led to this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think really to answer that, I really have to take it back quite a few years. I'm a third culture child, so half American, half Swedish, and grew up in many different countries. And I think that really shaped my outlook on life. It made me very much realize the importance of adapting to different contexts, different people. It kind of spurred a real interest in general, in people and in cultures and so forth. And I think maybe that didn't impact so much in the early years, but then when I in my career and in my first few years I spent in the world, in the financial services world, I think I came closer and closer to realizing that I wanted to be much more involved in a more people-centered role and moving away from more of a being a number cruncher or on the principal side to actually being on the agent side and actually being involved in growing and building businesses, but also having more of an impact And that really got me, after doing an MBA, and in my MBA, I'd spent a lot of time focusing on the softer subjects, as you call them, but leadership, organizational design, and so forth. I then had an opportunity to join a business called Rosetta Stone.
Yes, language learning.
That's right, language learning. And what was exciting about that was it really aligned with one of my, personal passions, which is language and cultures. But also an opportunity to really build something disruptive. A few years with Rosetta in Europe and in Latin America and in other parts of the world too. But really what inspired me was the impact that learning can have on people and people's lives. And I think I really saw firsthand in people learning a new language, being able to get a job they didn't think was possible for them before, or being able to connect with family members they hadn't been able to before. Many incredible stories. So really, I think that's when I fully understood the impact that learning can have on people, on society as a whole. And it's the late Nelson Mandela's comment, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And I think that's so true. So having spent a few years with Rosetta Stone, I then I went to another EdTech company and in the digital assessment space. Mm-hmm. And worked on a very different problem set, which was really redefining how learners are assessed and trying to change what is ultimately very much a process in education K through 12, where everyone's kind of teaching to the standardized exams, but trying to change and open up a new way of assessing learners. But how did I then transition into leadership business? More in the corporate learning and exec ed space, and I think that's really having seen the impact that education can have, and having seen how so much of the education space is still, in an old paradigm and not really addressing the needs that we have today. Having had the opportunity to meet with and interview for the position, I really fell in love with a vision that the two joint venture partners, the Financial Times and IE Business School, had in really redefining leadership development. It's been very similar for decades, and what was appropriate back then when the typical business school led executive education was developed is not really an approach that works in today's world. And I think seeing the opportunity that you can have by redefining the approach, making it much more relevant and applicable to leaders today, you can really have an impact on not just the individual organizations, but really on working towards some of these big challenges, transformational challenges that we have.
So that brings me to my next question. Now that you're the head of this important training company in leadership, what is your vision for leadership in the 21st century at Headspring?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I think I really want to start with the context in which we find ourselves today.
Okay,
and I think that like you're fully aware of the amount of different external factors that are impacting us. And I think it's easy to get a bit numbed by each and every one of these factors, but I'm not going too deeply. looking at climate change or the climate crisis that we're currently living through, and the incredible impact it can and will have on society as a whole. And that really necessitates a very different approach. So climate change being one of them. We see geopolitical shifts and threats, and very much a reshaping of, I'd say, the world order as we have lived so far. And that has tremendous impact on businesses and leaders. Change in globalization, and very importantly also the kind of nascent, call it AI revolution, or in a wider context, the fourth industrial revolution, but really the impact that machine learning, AI, automation will have on our society. So all of these individually, they are upheavals, but all of these combined together create an environment that I think most of us haven't really experienced, or the kind of shifts in the world, or that very few people have experienced.
So I think there you mentioned a couple of things that in a sense are quite slow burn. I mean, in terms of climate and AI, I mean, people on climate say, well, it's not slow burn, it's here and now. But in terms of the kind of decision-making cycles for political leaders, which tend to be around the kind of 4 or 5 year mark, climate is something where we say, okay, we have targets which are 5 years in advance, 10 years in advance, whatever. Meanwhile, over the last couple of years, those leaders have had to deal with very short-term, immediate shocks, like the Ukraine war. So, I was talking to a Learn Tech company the other day. They had a big part of their workforce who did all the development in Russia. Now they immediately had to pivot and grow another facility in a NATO country and shut down that because of the war, for instance. So that was a big change for them. And then, of course, the pandemic. Suddenly, your workforce is all remote, and all the other kind of shocks. So this combination of short-term shocks with longer-term things that you have to do something about, keep your eyes on. Is that, would you say, what characterizes the big challenge for leadership at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's one dimension. I think it's, another dimension is also the complex interdependencies of one shock and how that impacts secondary, tertiary, etc. So I think it's a highly complex set of factors that impact businesses and leaders, and consequently, it means decision making becomes more complex, and you need to set an organization up to thrive in such a new context. And I think if we then look at what we at Headspring believe, in the kind of leadership model of the 21st century, I think really to start with, it has to be purpose driven. And I think there are several factors to this. I think the first one is really, if you look at the responsibility that leaders have, the responsibility that business has to ensure longevity, if you will. I mean, it's been made very clear through the threats of the climate change that we experience and see, but so many others, and there is a responsibility that goes beyond what has been maybe the doctrine that was running for the better part of, I'd say, 40, 50 years, in basically focusing on one stakeholder, if you will, the shareholder. Yeah. And I think a purpose that goes beyond that, but a purpose that not only assumes part of the responsibility of improving society and bettering society, but also that obviously then engages the stakeholders that you work with as part of your ecosystem in the company. So I think purpose-driven is one really important point. And I think it's also, given that so much is in flux for people and so much is changing, a purpose can be a really strong anchor for people, and will help people understand and also be inspired by where and who they work for, if you will.
So there's a very rude name for this this trend, because it is a general trend in management and leadership, which is woke capital.
Yeah.
How do you unpick that? I mean, how do you look at this as a trend and say, what's driving this? Why do you think this is happening?
Well, I mean, I think it's again, there is always, when there is change, there's always an element of friction, and there will be opposing thoughts and so forth. And I think, we've seen, a lot of energy in parts, and maybe more so in the US when it comes to some of the topics of more purpose led responsible capitalism, if you will, and so forth. And I think that, there are, of course, people are looking for proof points of why is it better to be purpose-led, focus on sustainability or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the end of the day, we're looking for data points of profitability and so forth. I think that it's a natural consequence when there has been quite a big shift, really, in the last, call it 5, maybe 10 years, where this kind of purpose revolution, if you will, has started to come. And I think it's natural that you will see opposing views. And of course, it's hard to draw much longitudinal data on that so far.
So to get a bit more detailed, Headspring provides both custom and pre-designed programs. That must give you a pretty good view of to what extent the needs around leadership vary from one organization to another. In that, you have courses we can roll out to any organization, perhaps, or maybe, it's not like that. We have to bespoke a bit more to certain sectors, whatever. So how diverse is leadership learning? Is there a core of stuff that stays pretty constant with localization around the edge for different sectors and geographies? Or does each organization have its own specific and individual needs?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think that really the heart of Headspring, and very much the idea was and is that, we're custom from custom at heart. And why is that? I mean, we fundamentally believe and increasingly see from clients the need to understand their individual context before coming in and trying to create a learning journey for them. And I think, every company will have their own set of factors that are impacting them from an external perspective, and also their own culture, their own style of learning, what is important for them. And I think in that, it's a realization that if you develop a learning experience or journey, you need to get an engaged cohort. You need people to be engaged in that for it to have an impact. And again, it really requires customization to get that level of engagement. So in that, we see increasing amount of, you look at the surveys of CLOs and learning and development teams in general, and they're increasingly looking for custom experiences, because they realize that what is, call it, generically designed or off the shelf is oftentimes not working for them. So I'd say that do we see big differences? Is there kind of a common core which stays very much the same? I'd say there are elements that are that remains the same. If, for example, you're looking at something in and around diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course there will be topics and parts of the content which don't change company to company. And we therefore consequently have developed some pre-designs where you'll have a journey which has these building blocks where, okay, you might have 3-4 pieces which remain the same, but then you need to customize to understand what exactly is it this organization needs when they're looking at their, developing an inclusive culture. Maybe they have a problem more with kind of generational diversity, or maybe it's still a question of gender, or maybe it's LGBTQIA plus. There are so many different facets and factors that will impact the individual. So there are, of course, commonalities, but I'd say actually increasingly we're going towards a world where we need to customize to our clients more and more, and even personalize to really have that impact.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about personalization in the individual, but first, just one follow-up question on that is: can you see any kind of dimension which prompts the most changes? I think if you're doing diversity and inclusion, that might be very different in Hungary than it is, for instance, than it is in Sweden or Norway or Saudi Arabia. But if you look more generally, geography that makes for bigger differences, or is it size of company, or is it business sector even? I mean, the police service, for instance, may or defence may have a very different demands than on leadership, and a very different vision of leadership from, say, a retail organisation or a management consultancy. What is the dimension that? Is there one dimension that drives the biggest differences, would you say?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think actually, I'd say there might be kind of content differences and maybe focus differences between sectors and industries that you work with. But really, when it comes to leadership, I'd say that the geographical dimension still plays a role, and you'll see different. Like, again, if you do a diversity, equity, and inclusion program in Sweden, that might be very different from if you do it in the US or in Spain, as an example. And meeting the client where they are on that journey and call it kind of their value base. So I would say that the geographical dimension probably plays a bigger role than the others.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet, who uses it? Despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy. I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors, and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. So to focus more on the individual now, how much do leaders differ in their style of leadership? Does everyone find their own way of leading, or are there a limited number of normative styles people have to choose from? Your kind of situational leadership wheel, perhaps, that some people are more directive, some people more consultative. Or is there just one basic standard from which people deviate to the extent that they fall short of the ideal? I'm guessing that last kind of option probably isn't in tune with the times, at least. But how much how diverse is it for the individual to find their way of leading?
That's a really interesting question. I think we have seen an increasing trend in companies realizing that leadership is very much in the individual. I think, the idea that there is one type of leader that's more successful, or one kind of norm to benchmark against, that's I don't really think that's, as you say, in tune with today's reality. But I think that really the power is in realizing the strengths of the individual, and really for that individual to dial up those elements in which they can lead from, or those dimensions. And that is incredibly powerful, because if you think of it in a way where, much of the research around the power of diversity, diverse teams, cognitive diversity, and so forth, you will have seen for the better part of the last decade, the McKinsey studies or the WEF studies or whatever it might be, and looking at the performance of and the outperformance of diverse teams, if you will, and then realizing that actually it's diversity of thought in teams comes from kind of the different individuals and people actually having their own leadership story. And I think that's really the way that we see leadership moving, and where it's really powerful is at the end of the day, in today's world, you don't have one leader. You don't have just a leadership team. It needs to be democratized into the organization to be able to respond to these the warp speed that we need to work in. And then when you democratize leadership, you see it's about the individuals, their stories, how they can contribute, and how they create an environment in which their team will thrive. And in that sense, I think there are so many different styles of leadership that will shine through. And everyone has their own story to tell. Everyone has their own strength. And that's going to be crucial in an organization to really dial that up and not just focus on one or four different styles of leadership that you're trying to kind of shoehorn in.
So leadership learning as a category has its critics. I'm going to give quite a long, it's going to be quite a long question, this, I'm afraid, because I think it's worth citing some of the people who criticize from a kind of, from an educated point of view, rather than just sort of mudslinging. So Pfeffer at Stanford, Professor Pfeffer, that's quite difficult to say, says the leadership industry has failed. In his book, Leadership BS, and I'll leave it to the listener to work out what those initials stand for, he argues that its recommendations are based on an ideal world rather than on the real world. Among the prescriptions for better leadership, for example, is that leaders need to be truthful, when in reality, the ability to lie can be very useful for getting ahead. Skill at manipulation, writes Pfeffer, is a foundation of social power. In fact, he says there is a reciprocal relationship between power and lying. The powerful deceive more often, and the ability to deceive effectively creates social power. Extremely depressing, and I'm not going to relate that to politics in the UK over the last 4 or 5 years at all. Barbara Kellerman at Harvard says the leadership industry is self-satisfied, self-perpetuating, and poorly policed. There's a lot more that she has to say about leadership. She's thought very deeply about it. It's very interesting stuff. My podcast co-host, Donald Clark, on the Great Minds on Learning podcast, sister podcast to this one, doesn't pull his punches either. He says it's a cult. The courses are full of nice words like authenticity, modesty, transparency, and trust. Sun Tzu is out, touchy-feely is in. We don't need normative wish lists, but evidence in the realities of the workplace. So I'm afraid I've kind of given it to you both barrels there. But how do you answer these critics? I'm sure you've got a very cogent response.
I think you raise many really important and interesting points in this question and in these critiques. And I think actually some of this is also a reason to why Headspring was founded, conceived in the first place. Was very much to actually focus on the learner, create more of a learner-centric leadership development, much more practical and focusing on the actual challenge that the organization has. Coming from a context where one of our founding companies or shareholders is the Financial Times, BS and buzzwords don't really fly that far, and it would be quite a hard sell to be purely focused on that. But I would say that, of course, yes, it's been. I wouldn't say that the leadership development industry as such is broken. I'd say that, of course, there are approaches and offerings out there which are probably less relevant in today's society and don't create kind of impactful leaders at the end of the day. I think that when you look at the comment around, I think there was around deceiving and kind of misleading. Yeah. I think that's an interesting comment. I think that if you look at successful organizations today and leaders and their approach to why they succeed, it's of course you can create short-term gains by deceiving and lying maybe, but at the end of the day, that's never going to win in the long run. And the social power and other elements that might come. I think really what's interesting is the art of persuasion, the art of influencing, the art of getting your team, your co-workers to believe in you, to be inspired. And trust is, and might be a buzzword, but trust is actually something that is incredibly powerful, because by creating a culture of trust, you open people's minds, and you can basically create a team where the people are present. And by doing that, you have some incredibly powerful neuroscientific benefits. And there's a ton of research around this. And basically, what you want to be achieving is something which is generative listening, where you have presence, where you are creative, where you co-create together. And that brings you into a state of flow. It brings hyper creativity, hyper productivity, and so forth. And by doing and by and you only reach this by creating an environment where this is present. I think there are many great examples, and I'll just take one organization which probably went from maybe not one extreme to another, but went from at least one side of that was, you look at Microsoft before Satya Nadella, and what Satya Nadella has been able to do by creating this culture of psychological safety, this culture of trust, and this really a true learning organization. And you look at the incredible results and outcomes that you've had in that organization. And I think, and that's one example. There are so many examples of where the right leadership approach will have significant benefits and impact on organizations. I realize we don't have hours to talk about this, but
No,
I get quite passionate about it. So
yeah,
I think
absolutely. I mean, I suppose people might counter that, okay, you get a short-term bang for your bucks by adopting the Trump method, but eventually you get found out and for the court. That seems to be unspooling quite slowly. On the other hand, there are people we would classify as, I suppose, populist leaders like Orban, who has, I mean, if you measure it purely by longevity, he's been in the job for a long time. So, but I do hear what you're saying, that actually it's to do with what the results are of that leadership and building kind of sustainability, not only for your own presidency or for your company, but actually for a company and in a wider sense. What part does digital technology play in your course delivery? Presuming that you're kind of mainly face-to-face before with some digital, but presumably during the pandemic, you had to pivot like everybody else. What effects has that shock that we all went through had on your company, and how do you see the role of technology changing the way you deliver in future?
So absolutely. I mean, I think first of all, technology plays a big role in really all parts of the journey, if you will, and delivery, of course. So the pandemic, of course, put us forward many years. I think that prior to the pandemic, it was a lot lower. I mean, it was less than 50% that was either blended or pure online delivery. And now I think everything we design is really a blended form, needs to have the possibility of being hybrid. But I think the delivery element is just one part of it. And I think that, more and more organizations realize that, there is a lot of benefit in having parts of the journey online, parts of it face-to-face also, and in some cases the whole experience online. So I think that's it. This is kind of not just an important part of our strategy. I think it's really a hygiene factor in today's world. But I actually think what's interesting is how technology can amplify the experience and make it better than a fully custom designed face-to-face experience. And there are many examples to this. I think there are many forms of technology that can make it better. You look at machine learning and you look at how you can personalize journeys, not just custom, but really you customize an experience for a company, but then you can individualize and personalize the journey for each individual in that cohort. You can only really do that through technology. Another element is also you look at the possibilities that you can have with a metaverse, and we have done several years. We've been working with virtual reality and seeing how you can get really incredible engagement into the experience, engagement that really transcends what you do face to face. And if you can think about that engagement that you do, for example, in small parts in virtual reality, and you can then think about, okay, you can scale this to much, much larger cohorts of people, many more learners, then that's something that's very powerful, because you can get an emotional engagement into the learning experience, something that sometimes can be difficult in a 2D environment, in a Zoom-like or leveraging other delivery platforms, if you will. But the metaverse also has an incredible potential in really creating what can be a very engaging experience, not for one, but for many learners at the same time. So I think there are many benefits. that we see with technology, and we come from a very strong DNA of technology. The IE was the first university to develop a fully online program back in 2000, and so they're very much experimenting with technology. We do too. We see technology very much as something that can as a means to reaching your learning goals, if you will.
Okay. So staying with technology, but taking a bit of a step back from the last question and thinking in a more general sense about technology and leadership, in fields as diverse as medicine, finance, interpretation of data, driving vehicles, anywhere that involves decision-making, sometimes split-second decision-making especially, we see AI more and more that is equally good and often better than humans. And there have been kind of studies that compared AI diagnosis, interpretation of, I think it was X-rays compared with human, and proved that the AI can be better. So we see AI more and more that is as good or better than humans. So given that leadership is all about judgment, decisions, interpretation of the environment, how does this dynamic change the practice of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the key question. I think it's we've of course have been and are thinking deeply about this. I think to start with, yes, of course we see and we acknowledge that algorithms can be incredibly powerful, much faster, and you see so many examples of how organizations and leaders are really leveraging much more AI in their decision making in everything. So I think the important point is here. We believe very much in a kind of human-centered leadership approach, and we believe in a world where human and machine need to cohabit, work, live side by side. And really it's about leveraging the algorithms where they can more quickly and take better decisions, if you will, or where there is an obvious benefit for automation. Now, I think that is often where you have simple and clear parameters, where there is less interdependencies maybe, and where there is less of a need to leverage empathy or understanding the complexity of a situation, and in that the human beings still have they are still supreme, if you will, and I think that really what we see and will see is more that yes, the machines or the AI, let AI figure out the areas and be responsible for the areas where you get that productivity, where you get those better decisions ultimately. But when it comes to elements that require more creativity, more empathy, and more an ability to digest a variety of different complex inputs, then you'll still have a very strong role for the human leader. And I really think what becomes a very important factor in this is the kind of moral leadership and the ethical leadership that human beings can have. I mean, the machines are without a soul or without an ability to understand the morality, and therefore I think that really becomes a very important part of leadership for the human beings in understanding the moral elements and ensuring that we're doing the right things.
Do you think leaders are having to take on more and more those kind of moral and ethical judgments? And I could see AI kind of forcing that as we go forward. I mean, you can sort of think with generative AI. I now give a lot of tasks to ChatGPT that I previously in my career would have given to a marketing exec. Things like summarizing, synopsizing, and as more and more of this comes into sort of information-driven knowledge worker type roles, do you get to a point where playing to the shareholder needs would mean that, well, you'll automate whatever you can because it's going to save a lot of money because you can clear out half your marketing department and replace that with generative AI. Doesn't that at some point come into stark contrast with purpose-driven leadership, where you're kind of really looking to play also to the well-being of the workforce and the wider community, where it provides employment? And I think the bigger question I'm asking is: are we driving managers and leaders to have to make more and more moral decisions? I mean, presumably previously it wasn't so hard to lead a company. It was all about, okay, let's just make sure we make money and operate efficiently. Now it's, with great power comes great responsibility, if you like. They're all Spider-Men.
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, it's like the way you work with ChatGPT or what have you. Yes, of course, there are benefits in and you can get results far quicker. I think the question here is, I actually believe very much that with this also comes a whole host of new opportunities for types of roles that human beings can take. And ultimately, I think it comes down to, there's a big opportunity in reskilling so that we understand how we're going to direct, how we're going to use, how we're going to write the right algorithms in this. So I think, to the point of the question relating to morality, I think, yes, of course, we have an increasing responsibility to ensure that what we do and how we use AI is for good. And so there is a big moral element there, but I don't necessarily see that we have a difference in leadership that taking more immoral decisions or not. I'd rather think it's about, again, think of how do we ensure the longevity of the business, and how do we develop our people to make something greater with the technology that we have at our hands today. And so I think it's generative in essence, and not something where, we're going to have to cut this amount of staff and we're going to be using more and more AI to do the same job. So yeah.
Neatly done. You threw back that word generative at me and repurposed it. I'm impressed. And I've been very impressed throughout the interview. Thank you very much for taking the time today. Where should people go if they want to follow your thought and work and the work of Headspring? Follow us on LinkedIn, go to our website, sign up to our newsletter. So our website is headspringexecutive.com, and join the conversation. Thanks a lot for taking the time today, Gustav. Thank you, John.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors and patrons. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship and your Patreon contributions. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. And you can contribute at patreon.com/learninghack. We're wearing the white hat this month. Next week on Great Minds on Learning, we explore the thought of religious educators. And then the next Learning Hack, fittingly enough, is about ethical learning. Till then, stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.